Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere history class never dared to take you, into the bedchambers, salons, and shadowy corridors of power where mistresses, not monarchs, quietly pulled the strings of entire kingdoms. This is the story of royal mistresses, those unofficial queens and consorts who turned flirtation into foreign policy and whose influence reshaped dynasties, redirected wars, and occasionally blew up entire governments. Sounds dramatic? It absolutely is. And just a heads up, you probably won't survive this. Not politically, anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I don't need fake affection. I'm not mad at Pompadour. Also, drop your city and what time it is right now in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start in the most logical place, in bed. But not yours. We're slipping into a canopy-draped, velvet-sheeted royal bed, the kind that smells faintly of roses, musk, and betrayal. Picture this, it's the late Middle Ages. Kings are God-ordained and bored. Queens are usually arranged marriages, picked for their dowries or bloodlines. But love? That's outsourced. And who gets the real attention? The mistress. Don't roll your eyes, this wasn't just about sex. Royal mistresses were often the smartest people in the room. They had to be. One wrong word, and you're accused of witchcraft or heresy. One missed pregnancy, and your power evaporates. But land a king's heart, and you could become the shadow empress of Europe. In France, by the 15th century, this unofficial role was gaining official weight. Mistresses weren't just whispered about, they were expected. There was even a term for it, *matricientita*, meaning chief mistress, which, let's admit, sounds way better than side piece. These women had residences, titles, salaries, and sometimes diplomatic responsibilities. They weren't hiding, they were courtiers in full regalia, gliding past jealous nobles and stone-faced queens with the confidence of someone who knows she can get a royal pardon if she trips someone. The earliest mistresses weren't exactly official, but they left impact trails behind them. One standout is Alice Purras, mistress to England's Edward III in the 14th century. She was a commoner, probably a lady-in-waiting originally, and somehow managed to snag the attention of an aging king. While the country suffered under plague and political unrest, Alice was amassing lands, jewels, and enemies. Parliament actually passed laws aimed directly at stopping her influence. Imagine being so good at being hated that the government drafts legislation about you. Queen energy. But here's the kicker. People hated these women not because they were immoral, but because they had power they weren't supposed to have. It was the unearned access that rankled the nobles, not the romance. Kings could have mistresses, sure, but once those mistresses started sitting in on cabinet meetings or swaying tax decisions, suddenly there was a problem. Especially if you're a duke who's been waiting 10 years for a promotion, and suddenly that actress from the theatre gets her cousin made a bishop. Speaking of power struggles, let's not pretend the queens were helpless bystanders. Some queens plotted to get rid of their rivals. Others tried to work around them, and a few, like Catherine de' Medici, just sighed and handed over the keys to the king's heart, figuring if you can't beat them, outlive them. Now, here's a fringe little nugget. In medieval Spain, mistresses weren't always women. Some kings had male favorites, courtly companions who blurred the lines between friendship, counsel, and possibly more. Alfonso XI of Castile had multiple mistresses but was said to be oddly attached to a male courtier who mysteriously rose in rank. Historians argue over the details, but royal beds were a lot less heteronormative than most history books make them out to be. This brings us to a delicious scholarly debate still circling like gossip at a Versailles masquerade. Were these mistresses truly politically powerful, or were they merely decorative distractions while ministers and councils did the real work? Some argue their influence has been overblown, romanticized by later historians looking for scandal. Others say the opposite, that these women's political acumen has been unfairly dismissed, buried under layers of sexist pearl-clutching. The truth is probably both. Mistresses came in all flavors, schemers, saints, seductresses, and some who just wanted a pension and a pretty necklace. But what they all had in common was risk. As a royal mistress, your position was precarious. You could be adored 1 week, exiled the next. You could rise from a maid to a duchess or be poisoned at breakfast. No formal job title, no HR protection, just vibes and survival instincts. So why did they do it? Sometimes it was love, or something like it. Sometimes it was ambition. But often, it was the only way a woman in a rigid patriarchal society could wield real power. Behind every great king, there was a woman whispering something very smart or very dangerous into his ear. So tonight, you're not just watching a documentary. You're stepping into silk slippers, brushing off powdered wigs, and navigating the most glittering and cutthroat world history has to offer. The royal court, where your charm is your currency, your reputation is your weapon, and your future is always one flirtation or one scandal away from collapsing. And with that, the curtains part. Our first act begins in France, where the original official mistress breaks the mold and possibly the king's brain. You're standing in the glittering court of 15th century France, and everything smells like beeswax, crushed herbs, and ambition. The walls are draped in tapestries. The stone floors echo under slippered feet, and every noble eye is watching the same woman glide across the room. Her name is Agnes Sorel, and whether they adore her or despise her, no one can look away. Why? Because she's not just beautiful, she's dangerous. Welcome to the era of Charles VII, a king who came to power during the tail end of the 100 Years' War, looking more like a ragged warlord than a ruler. France was fractured, his court disorganized, and his mental health shaky at best. Enter Agnes, young, clever, and ambitious, with the kind of icy poise that could make even the most hardened knight drop his sword and stare. She wasn't a princess or a duchess or anyone of political consequence, really, but she was about to rewrite the rules. You first spot her not in a coronation scene or on a battlefield, but in a small corner of the royal household, dressed in the latest Italian silks with a neckline that makes the older courtiers choke on their wine. You'd think it was an accident, but no, Agnes knew exactly what she was doing. She was the first woman in the French court to publicly bare her chest in portraiture, with one breast elegantly displayed like it was no big deal. The court whispered, gasped, and copied her within weeks. Suddenly, every noble lady wanted to look like Agnes. Every man wanted to be seen with her. And the king? He was completely enthralled. Here's the twist, she wasn't just some pretty distraction. Agnes had opinions. She advised Charles VII on policy, supported his military campaigns, pushed for the removal of corrupt courtiers, and helped bolster his crumbling confidence after years of humiliation at the hands of the English and his own scheming relatives. Before Agnes, Charles was a broken man. After Agnes, he was crowned at Reims, thanks in part to a peasant girl named Joan of Arc and a mistress who knew how to turn admiration into momentum. The line between mistress and political operator had officially blurred. Here's your historical fact of the night. Agnes Sorel was the first woman in France to hold the official title of *Maitresse. Before her, mistresses were background characters, quiet lovers never formally acknowledged. Agnes changed that. She was given estates, titles, jewelry, and even bodyguards. She wasn't hidden in some dusty tower, she was paraded. The court seethed, but they obeyed. The clergy protested, but the king didn't care. For a while, Agnes ruled France from her silk-draped rooms with nothing but a raised eyebrow and a few well-timed whispers. Of course, not everyone clapped. The church wasn't thrilled about an official mistress flaunting herself around court, especially one who occasionally wore dresses that imitated the Virgin Mary a bit much, even by 15th century standards. But Charles protected her like she was made of porcelain and political leverage. That protection lasted until it didn't. In 1450, while heavily pregnant with her fourth child, Agnes suddenly became ill. At first, it seemed like food poisoning, stomach cramps, fatigue, but she died shortly afterward. You don't have to be a medieval detective to raise an eyebrow. Rumors flew: poison, murder, revenge, political assassination. One suspect was the king's own son, the future Louis XI, a famously ruthless man with a deep hatred for his father's inner circle. Another suspect. Pretty much anyone at court who'd been humiliated or sidelined by her rise, so, half the population. For centuries, her death was one of those murky mysteries historians whispered about. Then, in 2005, 500 years later, her remains were exhumed and tested. What did they find? Mercury. A lot of it. Enough to suggest she was either poisoned or treated very, very poorly for an illness. Was it medicine or murder? Historians still bicker. Some argue mercury was used to treat parasites or postpartum infections. Others say, no way, this was a hit job disguised as a fever. Whatever the truth, her death sent a message: rise too high, burn too bright, and you're playing with fire. Here's where things get weirdly fringe. After her death, people said Agnes started appearing in dreams not just to Charles, but to mystics, soldiers, and even Joan of Arc fanatics. She became part of a strange folklore: the sexy saint, the lost mother of France, the protector spirit of a broken king. Her image was etched into talismans. Her name was invoked during childbirth. Somewhere between scandal and sainthood, she slipped into legend. But even legends can't escape politics. After her death, Charles VII married her cousin not out of love, but convenience. The new woman never had the same glow, the same gravitational pull. The court tried to erase Agnes's impact, but it couldn't. Her fingerprints were all over royal policy. Her protégés remained powerful. Her enemies stayed afraid. Even her wardrobe continued to inspire fashion trends years after her death. Here's the thing no one likes to admit: sometimes a woman changes history not with a sword or a crown or a birthright, but with style, nerve, and a well-placed smirk. Agnes Sorel wasn't a general. She wasn't a noble by birth. But she was brilliant at being exactly what her king needed at a time when France desperately needed someone to hold him together. So tonight, as you fluff your pillow and get cozy under those covers, remember this: sometimes the future of a nation rests not in a war room, but in a candlelit chamber, where one sharp-eyed woman whispers, "You could be great again." Next up, a woman who didn't settle for being the king's mistress. She wanted the whole damn crown and got it, briefly. You're walking through the grand halls of Tudor England now, where the torches flicker low and the walls are thick with whispers. The ceilings are so high they vanish into darkness, and every footstep echoes like a judgment. Because this is a place where ambition isn't just dangerous, it's lethal. Tonight, you're going to brush up against the silk skirts and steel nerves of a woman who didn't just become a royal mistress, she played the long game and won. Sort of. Her name is Anne Boleyn, and she changed the fate of an entire kingdom. But don't get too comfortable, this one ends with a sword. Let's set the scene: England, early 1500s. King Henry VIII is trapped in a political and religious no-man's land. He's been married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 20 years, but the marriage isn't giving him what he really wants: a living male heir. Enter Anne Boleyn, clever, magnetic, fashion-forward, and absolutely not here for casual flirting. Unlike the standard royal mistress, Anne wasn't just aiming for influence. She wanted the ring, the crown, the whole blasted monarchy. And the shocking part? She got it. Anne was different from the typical courtly mistress. First of all, she refused to sleep with the king. That's right, refused. For 7 years, Henry chased her like a teenage boy with a lute, while Anne kept saying, "No ring, no kingdom, no me." That was revolutionary. While mistresses before her used beauty to climb the ladder, and used restraint. She turned seduction into a chess match, and Henry was obsessed. Here's a juicy historical fact for you: Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church just to marry her. He split England from Rome, invented the Church of England, and launched a religious transformation that would ripple across Europe for centuries, all because Anne wouldn't give him the time of day until she got a title. That's either a love story or a cautionary tale about hormonal monarchs, depending on your mood. But here's where it gets slippery: Anne wasn't loved by everyone. The common people whispered that she was a witch. Nobles accused her of being too political, too proud. Even Queen Catherine's supporters, who still saw her as the rightful queen, despised Anne. She was called the concubine, the great whore, and the goggle-eyed harlot. The court turned into a minefield, with Anne dancing through it like a woman who didn't quite realize the ground was about to crack beneath her heels. And oh, did she dance? Anne didn't just accept the title of queen, she remade it in her image. She brought French fashions to court, supported humanist scholars, and was famously opinionated in political affairs. She clashed with Thomas Cromwell, tried to influence foreign policy, and wasn't shy about criticizing her husband, the king, mind you, when she disagreed with his choices. The idea of a queen being silent and obedient. That ship had sailed. And had opinions, and she wasn't afraid to air them loudly. So now you're thinking, good for her, right? Strong woman, clever, fearless. But this is Tudor England. Strong women don't get applause, they get trials. Here's the historical debate. Was Anne Boleyn framed? Just 3 years after she got that crown on her head, and was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Yes, incest with her own brother, totally casual stuff. The evidence was paper-thin, her accusers men with everything to gain from her downfall. Her biggest mistake. She'd stopped being the king's obsession. And had given birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, yes, Elizabeth, and had several miscarriages after. Henry, never known for his patience, started eyeing her ladies-in-waiting. History may say she was executed for adultery, but the real charge was probably this: she'd lost her usefulness. Here's a quirky little fact: Anne Boleyn may have had 6 fingers on one hand. At least, that's what the gossip said. It might have been an extra nail or a small deformity, but in an era of witch-hunting and superstition, that was enough to brand her as unnatural. Her enemies called her the devil's consort. The truth was probably less dramatic, but the story stuck because nothing fuels a smear campaign like a dash of sorcery. When her time came, Anne didn't beg. She walked to the scaffold in a plain grey dress, composed, no wild weeping, no shrieking. She addressed the crowd with a small, gracious speech, no mention of innocence or injustice, just a prayer for the king's health and the country's future. Then she knelt, tucked her coif, and waited for a French swordsman, specially imported to make it clean, to end her reign. One clean stroke, no screams, just silence. That moment, that single swing, did more than kill a queen. It left behind a daughter who would go on to become one of the greatest monarchs in British history, Elizabeth I. Whether Anne knew it or not, her legacy wouldn't be in the marriage she won or the king she lost, it would be in the fire she passed on to her daughter, a queen raised in the shadow of scandal who learned to navigate power without ever marrying anyone at all. A woman who ruled alone. The scholarly bickering around Anne Boleyn's true influence never ends. Was she a pawn or a power player? A victim of a ruthless king or an ambitious woman who gambled too hard? The truth, as always, is a royal mess, probably some of both. She was loved, hated, and feared, often at the same time. She helped create a new church, ended a 20-year marriage, and became the first English queen to be executed. So, yeah, she made an impression. Tonight, as you lie under your blanket, picture the candlelit hall where Anne once held court. Imagine the sound of her laugh echoing against stone, the rustle of her silk skirts as she turned heads and whispered plans. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous woman in the room isn't the one shouting orders, it's the one who makes kings change religion just to earn her smile. Next, you're heading to France again, where another mistress holds court. But this one doesn't just dabble in influence, she directs the show like a royal producer, from her bath to the battlefield. You're back in France now, but not in the war-torn medieval kingdom you saw before. This time, the Renaissance is in full swing. The scent of blooming gardens clings to the air. Perfumes drift from passing courtiers, and classical art glimmers on walls polished with wealth and power. The French court at Fontainebleau is dripping in beauty and intrigue. In the middle of it all, wrapped in satin and riding a white horse through the king's personal garden like she owns the place, because she kind of does, is Diane de Poitiers. Let's be clear, you're not supposed to root for her. She's 35 when she becomes mistress to the French king, and he's 15. Yeah, read that again. It's one of the most eyebrow-raising relationships in royal history, but it's also one of the most enduring and politically potent. Diane wasn't just some passing fancy, she was the power behind the young King Henry II for over 2 decades. She wasn't just sleeping with the king, she was running the kingdom. It starts like this. Diane is widowed young, sharp as a blade, and incredibly well-read. She understands astrology, philosophy, architecture, and, most importantly, how men think. She's poised, gracious, and completely terrifying if you cross her. After her husband dies, she dons black and gold mourning clothes and never takes them off, not because she's grieving forever, but because it becomes her brand. Diane is the prototype for power widow chic, mysterious, stylish, slightly untouchable. She wears her reputation like armor. Here's your historical fact: Diane de Poitiers essentially served as co-ruler of France without ever holding a title. She had her own political network, wrote letters in the king's name, and even reviewed royal decrees before they went out. Her symbol, a crescent moon, was carved into buildings alongside the king's own monogram. Imagine walking through the royal gardens and seeing her initials entwined with his, like they were married. It wasn't subtle, and Diane was not subtle. She bathed daily in cold water and white wine, insisted on rigorous horseback riding to keep her figure, and maintained flawless skin well into her 60s, no easy feat in an era where lead-based makeup was practically required. She commissioned stunning fountains and palaces, including the Château de Chinon-Sieu, which the king gave to her over his own wife, Queen Catherine de Medici. That went over *super well. Now, about Catherine. Imagine being the Queen of France, married to the king, birthing 10 children, and still being sidelined for a woman 20 years older than your husband. That's the rage Catherine lived with every day. She couldn't confront Diane directly. Diane was too beloved, too untouchable. But she watched, learned, and waited. Oh, did she wait? Back to Diane, she wasn't just guiding policy from a velvet armchair. She had opinions on war, urged Henry to support certain alliances, dissuaded him from trusting some nobles, and even shaped the aesthetics of the royal court. She preferred Roman antiquity themes, so suddenly everything was marble columns and gold laurel crowns. If Diane said peacock feathers were in, everyone else threw theirs away. It wasn't just influence, it was domination. Here's your quirky fringe fact: Diane drank gold. Literally. She believed consuming small amounts of gold dissolved in liquid would preserve her youth. She basically sipped on precious metals like a medieval Gwyneth Paltrow. The irony: when her remains were exhumed centuries later, they found her bones contained abnormally high levels of gold. Whether it worked or not depends on your standards. She looked great, but died at 66, which wasn't bad for the 16th century, but definitely didn't make her immortal. Even golden mistresses have to die metaphorically when the king does. In 1559, Henry II died suddenly in a jousting accident, a freak splinter to the eye, as horrible as it sounds, and Diane's world collapsed overnight. Catherine de Medici wasted zero time. She stripped Diane of her properties, demanded the return of Château de Chinon-Sieu, and banished her from court. The queen finally had her moment, and she made sure Diane felt every ounce of it. Here's where the scholarly debate gets spicy. Was Diane de Poitiers a stabilizing force in France, or did she weaken the monarchy by entrenching favoritism? Some historians see her as a wise, capable figure who kept Henry focused and the court functional. Others argue her control fueled resentment and political stagnation, empowering the kind of personal loyalty that undercuts institutions. Both views have merit. What's clear is that Diane didn't just influence the crown, she was the crown, at least in how it moved, glittered, and made decisions. As her power faded, Diane retired quietly to her estate at Annette. No rebellion, no memoir, just silence and stature. She left behind one of the most visually striking courts in French history, her crescent moon motif echoing in the gardens and walls she helped design. Her enemies painted her as a calculating seductress, a political manipulator who bedazzled a boy king and sidelined a nation's queen. Her defenders saw her as a Renaissance woman par excellence, one of the most brilliant, capable courtiers France ever knew. Tonight, as you pull your covers up a little tighter, imagine riding through the misty woods of 16th century France, trailing behind a veiled figure in black and gold, the moonlight catching on her silver hair, her eyes sharper than a fine blade. She doesn't need a title, she is the throne. At least until someone takes it from her. Now, you find yourself in Paris at the tail end of the 16th century, and everything feels tense, like the air itself is holding its breath. The cobblestones are slick with rain, and the alleys echo with the clatter of gossip. France is staggering through wars of religion, Protestant versus Catholic, nobles versus monarchs, and at the center of this exhausting mess is a woman lounging in silks, her hand idly tracing the rim of a wine glass while the kingdom teeters. Her name is Gabrielle d'Estrées, and she's not just another royal mistress. She is, briefly, powerfully, and fatally, almost a queen. Picture this: Henry IV, the first Bourbon king of France, is newly crowned but not yet solid in his power. The kingdom is a mess: years of civil war, regional uprisings, and a deeply divided population. Henry needs unity, credibility, and, most of all, a Catholic queen. Unfortunately for him, he's in love with Gabrielle, a noblewoman who checks none of the expected boxes. She's not royal, not married anymore, and definitely not universally adored. But Henry is completely undone by her. Here's your historical fact: Gabrielle d'Estrées wielded more power than any mistress in French history up to that point. Henry IV referred to her as his true wife, included her in political discussions, and signed state documents as Henry and Gabrielle, as if they were co-rulers. Just soak that in: a mistress being named on official paperwork. That's not romance, that's power. Gabrielle advised the king on navigating the thorny religious politics of the time, encouraging his famous decision to convert to Catholicism in 1593. You've probably heard the quote, "Paris is worth a mass." That moment wasn't just strategy, it was the kind of maneuver Gabrielle was pushing for. She wasn't just thinking about their love, she was thinking about the nation. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. The nobles, many of whom were Catholic hardliners, couldn't stomach the idea of a former Protestant mistress becoming queen. The Pope was barely willing to accept Henry himself, let alone Gabrielle. The women of the court whispered, mocked her, spread rumors. One wrote that she had the face of a Madonna and the heart of a harlot, which, honestly, sounds like a fantastic business card. So, what made Gabrielle so threatening? For one, she was stunning. Her famous portrait, yes, the one where she's sitting in a bath and her sister's casually pinching her nipple, Google it when you're not in bed, became an icon of sensuality and scandal. But more than that, she was smart. Calculating, yes, but not cold. She balanced ambition with affection, and Henry trusted her judgment as much as he craved her presence. That mix was unforgivable in a court where most mistresses were expected to smile, nod, and stay out of strategy. By 1599, Henry had decided he was going to marry Gabrielle. He even got an annulment from his first marriage. Wedding plans were underway. The court was frothing at the mouth. Gabrielle, now heavily pregnant with their fourth child, received a golden coronet, a literal symbol of queenship. She was inches from the crown. And then she died, suddenly and violently, at age 26. She collapsed in pain while dining at the home of a court official and died soon after, suffering convulsions and vomiting. The diagnosis at the time was eclampsia, complications from pregnancy. But even then, people weren't buying it. Rumors of poisoning spread like wildfire. After all, her death came at exactly the moment when her queenship seemed inevitable. The timing was just a little too perfect. One noble reportedly toasted her death, saying, "Now France is saved." Here's the scholarly debate: was Gabrielle d'Estrées murdered to stop her from becoming queen? There's no solid evidence, no signed confession. But considering the political stakes, the number of enemies she had, and the nature of her symptoms, it wouldn't be the first time a royal mistress mysteriously died right before achieving ultimate power. Modern historians go back and forth: childbirth-related, a stroke, or someone slipping something into her wine glass while pretending to be her friend. Here's a bizarre little side note for your sleepy brain: Gabrielle's heart was embalmed separately and placed in a gold box in the Abbey of Morbesson. Yes, just her heart. It stayed there for centuries, guarded like a relic. Why? Because Henry loved her so deeply, he couldn't bear to bury her whole body. When he heard she had died, he reportedly wept uncontrollably and locked himself in his chambers, this from a man who once said he loved war more than women. That should tell you everything. After Gabrielle's death, Henry married someone else, Marie de Medici, a politically safe choice with a massive dowry. He did what kings do, moved on for the sake of the realm. But he never gave another woman the kind of influence Gabrielle had. She remained the great what-if of his reign. What if she had lived? What kind of queen would she have been? Would the Bourbon dynasty have looked different? Would France have seen its first unofficial co-ruler centuries before it entertained the idea of a female monarch? We'll never know. Tonight, as you sink deeper into your blanket, Imagine Gabrielle standing in the shadows of Notre Dame, dressed in royal silks, fingers brushing the crown she would never wear. A heartbeat away from history, a love story rewritten as a cautionary tale. She was almost queen, but in France, almost is the most dangerous place to be. Next, the party kicks off in Restoration England, where mistresses weren't just lovers, they were celebrities and sometimes spies. You're stepping out of the shadowy halls of French ambition and into something altogether looser, louder, and soaked in wine, Restoration England. The year is 1660. Puritan rule has collapsed. Cromwell is dead, and the monarchy has come crawling back in with wigs, ruffles, and a level of debauchery not seen since the days of the Roman Empire. King Charles II is back on the throne, and is making up for lost time. Big time. Gone are the days of somber court protocol and moral policing. Now it's all poetry, theatre, and beds that barely cool between visitors. You're in London, walking through Whitehall Palace. There's music drifting from some distant chamber, and somewhere nearby, someone is laughing too loudly. The court is packed, not with the pious or powerful, but with poets, dancers, gamblers, and a healthy mix of pickpockets and nobles dressed like actors. Because Charles II doesn't care what you are, as long as you're entertaining. And his mistresses. They are the entertainment. Let's not pretend these were just trysts. These women were power brokers, celebrity influencers, sometimes spies, and always being watched. They wielded influence not because they came from noble stock, but because they knew how to keep the king's attention and turn that attention into power, property, and prestige. The merry gang, as you'll come to know them, were practically co-rulers in their own right. So tonight, you're getting to know a few of them not just as mistresses, but as the women who redefined what it meant to hold court from the king's bed. Let's start with a name that still sparkles. Barbara Palmer, later made the Countess of Castlemaine. She was wild, willful, and, depending on who you ask, completely deranged. And Charles was obsessed. She gave birth to 5 of his children, screamed at him in public, full-on shouting matches in the corridors of court, had other lovers, got into brawls with ladies-in-waiting, and allegedly once beat a rival with a hairbrush. Barbara didn't play court politics the quiet way, she played loud, and she played dirty. But somehow, she always landed on her feet. Here's your historical fact. Charles II had at least 13 known mistresses and fathered more than a dozen illegitimate children, but not one legitimate heir. That right there is the Restoration in a nutshell, chaotic, indulgent, and deeply unstable beneath the glitter. The king's refusal to marry someone who could give him a legitimate Protestant heir nearly threw the monarchy into crisis. But did he care? Barely. He was too busy funding the theatre, sneaking off to masked balls, and charming the population with his easy wit and full head of luscious, well-maintained hair. Barbara wasn't alone, of course. There was also Louise de Keroualle, the elegant French mistress who played the long game. While Barbara brawled, Louise plotted. She was a calculated import from the court of Louis XIV, sent to charm Charles and maybe spy for France. She did both with a velvet smile. People hated her, she was Catholic, a foreigner, and polished to the point of perfection. But Charles adored her. She received jewels, estates, and titles, becoming the Duchess of Portsmouth and holding court like a queen in everything but name. Here's your fringe fact. Louise had a custom-made bed with a secret drawer underneath to hide letters she smuggled for the French crown. That's not confirmed, but come on, this is Restoration England. You've got actresses sneaking into court in disguise, courtiers dueling over love notes, and one mistress literally falling out of favor because she farted during a dance, looking at you, Hortense Mancini. A hidden spy drawer is downright reasonable. The real power of these women wasn't espionage, it was visibility. They weren't just in the king's bed, they were in his court. They received ambassadors, were painted by court artists, praised in poetry, and sometimes appealed to by desperate politicians hoping to bend the king's ear. Charles wasn't a particularly decisive ruler, and many ministers knew that getting their policy through might require an offhand whisper to Lady Castlemaine or a flattering gift to the Duchess of Portsmouth. Here's the scholarly debate that still gets tossed around like a goblet of cheap claret. Were Charles's mistresses simply distractions, or were they essential political actors in a dysfunctional system? Some say they undermined the state with frivolity and favoritism. Others argue they acted as informal diplomats, stabilizing the king's moods and smoothing over tensions in a court constantly on the edge of scandal. The answer, like everything in this era, is complicated. They were both charming chaos agents and, in some cases, the grease that kept the royal wheels turning. Let's not forget that Charles's court was the original media circus. The newly relaxed censorship laws meant gossip pamphlets, woodcut prints, and political cartoons exploded. Everyone wanted the dirt, and the mistresses were the main characters. Barbara was portrayed as a she-devil, Louise as a snake in a velvet gown. Their fashion choices were copied, mocked, and then copied again. They were torn apart in satire and worshipped in style. If you think reality TV invented love triangles and revenge arcs, think again. Tonight, as you lie back and drift off, picture a candlelit salon somewhere inside Whitehall. The king's voice drifts through the corridors, witty, charming, slightly drunk. A woman in a sapphire blue gown glides across the floor, every eye turning toward her. She isn't royal by birth. She doesn't wear a crown, but her influence, oh, it's as heavy as gold. She knows every rumor, every alliance, and exactly how far a well-timed smile can stretch. Restoration England didn't run on ministers and monarchs, it ran on actresses, adventuresses, and mistresses who knew that power was never about titles. It was about proximity. And they were always so close. Next, you'll walk beside the most beloved of Charles's lovers, a former orange seller who stole the king's heart and the country's affection without ever losing her sense of humor. You're standing at the edge of a raucous London theatre, the kind where the laughter is loud, the gossip even louder, and someone just spilled ale on your shoes. Welcome to Drury Lane, mid-1660s, where the restoration is in full swing, and the stage is more than entertainment, it's a launchpad for social climbing, scandal, and stardom. Tonight, all eyes are on a woman darting through the crowd, arms full of oranges and attitude. She's cracking jokes, maybe slipping a few into gentlemen's pockets, maybe slipping a note into their hands. She's fast, funny, and completely unbothered by the rigid social rules around her. You'll know her name soon, Nell Gwynn, the mistress who went from fruit seller to national treasure and made the British monarchy just a little bit more likable. Let's start at the bottom, because that's exactly where Nell came from. Born in 1650 in Covent Garden, back when it was more grit than glamour, her mother ran a brothel, and her father vanished early. Nell grew up learning how to get by with charm, wit, and the uncanny ability to make people listen. As a child, she worked in a tavern, then later sold oranges at the King's Theatre. Not exactly a resume for royalty, but Nell had something most courtiers lacked: she was real. Soon, she was on stage. Nell became one of England's first professional actresses at a time when women were just beginning to be allowed on stage. Her comic timing was impeccable, her smile disarming, and she made the audience feel like she was in on the joke with them, which, let's be honest, she absolutely was. She starred in bawdy comedies, often playing clever servant girls or scheming mistresses. Typecasting, maybe, but Nell turned those roles into masterclasses in charm and irreverence. Here's your historical fact: Nell Gwynn was the most beloved of Charles II's many mistresses by the people. She wasn't noble. She wasn't foreign. She didn't scheme. She didn't even try to be respectable. And somehow, that made her unforgettable. While other royal mistresses were accused of espionage or religious manipulation, Nell was cracking jokes about Catholic priests and calling out Charles's other mistresses in public. Once, her coach was mistaken for that of the king's Catholic mistress, Louise de Keroualle. When the angry crowd started shouting insults, Nell stuck her head out the window and yelled, "Pray, good people, be civil. I am the Protestant whore." The crowd roared with laughter and let her pass. Louise would never. Here's a fringe little fact: Nell Gwynn is believed to be one of the first celebrities to use what we'd now call a PR strategy. She didn't just let people love her, she gave them reasons to. She poked fun at herself, never apologized for her past, and leaned into the absurdity of being a poor actress turned royal mistress. And it worked. She became England's sweetheart, not because she was perfect, but because she was transparent. People didn't just admire Nell, they rooted for her. Charles II was no fool. He liked mistresses for many reasons, but with Nell, he got more than beauty. He got loyalty, humor, and a break from the exhausting pretense of court life. Their relationship lasted for nearly 2 decades. She bore him 2 sons, one of whom, Charles Beauclerk, was later made the Duke of St. Albans. Not bad for someone who used to hawk fruit outside a playhouse. Unlike the more political mistresses of the time, Nell never tried to grab at state power. She didn't meddle in foreign affairs or pressure the king for government appointments. Her ambitions were different. She wanted security, a comfortable life, and to keep the king smiling. And she did. Tonight, as you drift off, imagine Nell Gwyn darting through the chaotic buzz of Drury Lane, her laughter cutting through the noise, her eyes bright with mischief. She's not scheming for a crown or a title, she's just Nell, the orange seller who made a king fall in love and a nation cheer for her. In a world of silk gowns and secret drawers, she was the one who reminded everyone that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can be is yourself. Nell Gwyn, a beloved figure of Restoration England, rose from humble beginnings to become one of King Charles II's most famous mistresses. Born into poverty, possibly in a brothel, she climbed the social ladder through her wit and charm as an actress, catching the king's eye in the 1660s. Unlike many mistresses, Nell was apolitical, focusing on security for her children, a comfortable home, and later, noble titles for her sons. Charles reportedly urged his brother James II on his deathbed in 1685 not to let poor Nellie starve, ensuring her pension continued. Scholars debate whether Nell's presence at court was a strategic move to humanize the monarchy during a time of anti-Catholic riots and political unrest, or merely a charming distraction. Her working-class Protestant background made her relatable, possibly softening public perception of the crown. After her death in 1687, Nell's legacy endured as a symbol of cheeky English sensuality, her name gracing pubs, theatres, and even slang, embodying the street-smart woman who triumphed through charm. In contrast, Louise de Querouaix, Duchess of Portsmouth, was a polarizing figure at Charles II's court. Arriving from France in the 1670s, she was Catholic, polished, and suspected of being a spy for Louis XIV. Holding the role of royal mistress longer than any other during Charles's reign, she amassed wealth, titles, and influence, reportedly receiving payments from both kings. Her apartments, possibly equipped with secret tunnels, fueled speculation of espionage. English courtiers despised her as a symbol of Catholic and foreign influence, yet Charles kept her close, even as Nell Gwyn mocked her as Squintabella. Historians debate whether Louise was a French agent manipulating foreign policy or a scapegoat for anti-Catholic paranoia. After Charles's death, she fled to France with immense wealth, living luxuriously until 1734, outlasting her rivals and leaving a legacy of subtle, strategic power. Across the Channel, Madame de Montespan dominated Versailles as Louis XIV's chief mistress in the 1660s and 1670s. Charismatic and ambitious, she eclipsed the Queen, wielding influence over court appointments and policy. Her reign was marred by the affair of the poisons, a scandal involving black masses, poison, and alleged infant sacrifices to maintain the king's favor. Though never charged, the accusations, possibly fueled by rivals jealous of her power, tarnished her reputation. As Louis grew more devout, Montespan's influence waned, and she was replaced by the pious Madame de Maintenon, retiring from court and dying in 1707. Scholars debate whether she truly engaged in occult practices or was a victim of court politics and misogyny, her story a blend of power and dark rumor. Madame de Maintenon, originally governess to Montespan's children with Louis XIV, became the king's secret wife around 1683 after the queen's death. Her quiet piety transformed the decadent Versailles court, replacing lavish parties with religious restraint. She founded a school for noble daughters, blending compassion with control, but her somber demeanor made her unpopular among courtiers nostalgic for Montespan's extravagance. Maintenon's influence extended to policy, including the controversial revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which harmed France's economy. Historians debate whether she was truly married to Louis or simply a close companion, but her subtle power reshaped the monarchy's tone. She died quietly in 1719, her legacy one of understated authority. Madame du Barry, the last official mistress of France before the Revolution, entered Versailles in the 1770s as Louis XV's vibrant, unapologetic companion. Born into poverty and rising as a courtesan, she embraced luxury without political ambition, earning the nobility's scorn for her past. Her extravagance, like commissioning an exorbitantly expensive perfume, symbolized royal excess as France's economic woes grew. After Louis XV's death in 1774, she was banished, and during the Revolution, her wealth made her a target. Executed in 1793, Du Barry's death marked the end of the royal mistress tradition. Scholars debate whether she was a frivolous symbol of a failing monarchy or a scapegoat for systemic collapse, her story a tragic finale to a gilded era. In Russia, Catherine the Great's court in the late 18th century treated lovers as political appointments. Her favorites, like Grigory Potemkin, were vetted for charm and utility, often gaining titles and influence. Potemkin, possibly her secret husband, was a key partner in governance, helping conquer Crimea and reform the army. Catherine's system ensured loyalty but not permanence. Favorites faced exile or disgrace when their time ended. A persistent myth, born of misogyny, falsely claimed she died in a scandalous incident, when in fact she suffered a stroke in 1796. Historians debate whether her favorites were true political partners or ornamental consorts, but Catherine's ruthless intelligence defined her reign, her lovers amplifying her power. Finally, Maria Walewska, a Polish noblewoman, became Napoleon's mistress in 1807, encouraged by patriots hoping she could secure Poland's independence. Her affair was diplomatic, driven by duty rather than passion, and produced a son, Alexandre. Despite her loyalty, including visiting Napoleon in exile on Elba, her influence on policy was limited, and he largely forgot her after their affair. Dying young in 1817, Maria's story raises questions about whether she was a patriot or a pawn, her brief role a poignant intersection of personal sacrifice and political ambition. Each woman, Nell's charm, Louise's intrigue, Montespan's audacity, Maintenon's restraint, Du Barry's extravagance, Catherine's calculation, and Maria's duty shaped their era's emotional and political landscape, proving that power, even from the margins, could leave a lasting mark. Lola Montez, born Eliza Gilbert in 1821, was a whirlwind of reinvention who stormed through 19th-century Europe as a self-styled Spanish dancer and seductress. Not Spanish, noble, or even particularly skilled, she crafted the persona of Lola Montez, captivating audiences with her provocative performances. By 1846, she arrived in Munich, where she ensnared King Ludwig I of Bavaria, an aging monarch obsessed with beauty. Within days, she was installed in the palace. Within weeks, she was Countess of Landsfeld. Lola wielded real power, influencing policy, dismissing ministers who opposed her, and pushing liberal reforms, supposedly for the artists and students she charmed. Infamously, she once horsewhipped a nobleman who insulted her, cementing her scandalous reputation. A fringe tale claims she kept a pet bear, fed brandy-soaked pastries, though evidence is shaky but entirely plausible for her chaotic life. Munich citizens, however, revolted against her influence, branding her a she-devil. By 1848, amid revolutionary fervor, Ludwig was forced to exile her. When she returned, his refusal to rule without her led to his abdication, a king toppled, in part, by his devotion to her. Historians debate whether Lola was a revolutionary advocating progress or a narcissistic force of destruction. After Bavaria, she toured Europe, dodging lawsuits, wrote a beauty guide, and performed in the US, dying in New York in 1861, broken repentant at 39. Lola didn't stumble into power, she seized it, leaving chaos and legend in her wake. In Imperial Russia, the early 1800s saw a shadowy whisper network of women wielding unofficial power. Unlike the celebrated mistresses of France, Russian royal lovers like Maria Narishkina, mistress to Tsar Alexander I, operated in secrecy, without titles or public acclaim. Maria, who bore Alexander 4 children, accompanied him to the 1815 Congress of Vienna, treated like a queen without the title, yet resented by the court. These women were more than lovers. They were spies, messengers, and confidants, gathering intelligence in a paranoid court where ministers feared speaking truth. Catherine the Great had pioneered this system, using her favorites to monitor nobles and foreign courts, a practice that lingered under Alexander's secretive reign. A curious fringe fact: some mistresses were vetted by retired noblewomen, assessing their manners and reputation before royal introduction, a diplomatic matchmaking process. Yet, the role was perilous. A misstep could mean exile, poisoning, or disappearance. Scholars debate whether this network stabilized the monarchy by providing unfiltered insights or destabilized it through favoritism and corruption. By the 20th century, this system's dangers were evident in Rasputin's corrosive influence on Tsarina Alexandra, a twisted evolution of the whisper network that helped topple the Romanovs. Morganatic marriages, common in German and Austrian courts, were legal loopholes allowing royals to marry beneath their status without granting their spouse or children inheritance rights. These left-handed marriages preserved bloodlines but humiliated the women involved, like Countess Sophie Chotek, who married Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Despite their love, Sophie was barred from sitting beside him at events, and even in death after their 1914 assassination, she was denied a full royal burial. A fringe detail: some ceremonies used a left-handed handshake, symbolizing a lesser bond. Morganatic wives, often former actresses or minor nobles, lived in luxury but were excluded from official recognition, their children barred from succession. Ludwig IV of Hesse-Darmstadt's wife, Countess Magdalene, and King Leopold I of Belgium's partner, Arcady Claret, faced similar constraints. Historians debate whether these marriages were progressive compromises or patriarchal tools that demeaned women, forcing them into a liminal existence of love without legacy. Queen Victoria's grief after Prince Albert's 1861 death reshaped her life, leading to intense, ambiguous relationships with servants John Brown and Abdul Karim. Brown, a blunt Scottish gillie, became her closest companion, calling her woman and sleeping outside her door. After his 1883 death, Victoria mourned him as fervently as Albert, erecting a memorial. A fringe fact: she was buried with Brown's hair, photo, and his mother's ring, hinting at a bond beyond friendship. Karim, an Indian clerk turned munshi, taught her Urdu and received titles, despite court resentment. Her son Edward VII destroyed much of their correspondence, erasing Karim's influence. Scholars debate whether these were romantic, platonic, or emotional dependencies born of loneliness. Victoria's attachments, defying royal norms, suggest a woman seeking connection beyond her crown. King Edward VII, Bertie, transformed the British monarchy with his unapologetic romantic escapades. With over 50 mistresses, including actresses like Lily Langtry and reformers like Daisy Greville, he made scandal a public charm offensive. His lovers were social fixers, hosting salons and easing diplomatic tensions. A fringe fact: Edward's custom-built siege machine bed in a Paris brothel, complete with ropes and mirrors, catered to his theatrical tastes. His openness humanized the monarchy after Victoria's dour reign, though some argue it cheapened the crown's dignity. His mistresses, far from hidden, were celebrities, shaping trends and politics. Queen Alexandra tolerated most, though tensions arose over seating arrangements. Edward's 9-year reign was lively and cosmopolitan, with his lovers as key players in a modernized monarchy. Alice Keppel, Edward VII's most enduring mistress, was a strategic force. From 1898, she served as confidant and unofficial diplomat, soothing political disputes and influencing treaties. Unlike flashier predecessors, she avoided scandal, securing promotions for her husband and maintaining cordial relations with Queen Alexandra. A striking fringe fact: Alice is Queen Camilla's great-grandmother, linking her to today's royal family. Despite her influence, she received no official title, existing in the monarchy's margins. Edward's deathbed summons of her in 1910 underscored their bond, though she wept, insisting she only tried to do some good. Historians debate whether Alice stabilized Edward's reign or was a cunning social climber. Her legacy, woven into the royal bloodline, proves the lasting impact of a mistress who played the game flawlessly. These women, Lola's chaos, Russia's whisperers, morganatic wives' silent struggles, Victoria's intimate bonds, Edward's public lovers, and Alice's quiet power, show how mistresses shaped history from the shadows, their influence rippling through courts and centuries. She believed in the institution even as she undermined it from within. She supported Edward without trying to replace the Queen, and she managed her own family in parallel. Her daughters married well, her husband kept his dignity, and her social calendar remained full until her final years. After Edward's death, Alice quietly left the inner royal circle. She didn't write memoirs. She didn't sell letters. She didn't do interviews. She knew the game, and she'd already won. She retired to Italy and lived in Florence until her death in 1947, surrounded by art, wine, and a carefully curated silence. When Camilla began her relationship with Prince Charles decades later, family members couldn't help but smile and say, well, it runs in the blood. So tonight, imagine Alice stepping out of a carriage at Buckingham Palace, not a hair out of place, glancing once at the press, then gliding through the side entrance, not because she had to sneak in, but because she knew exactly where to be. She isn't scandal, she's survival. She's the blueprint for modern royal mistresses, visible enough to be important, invisible enough to never be dangerous. Her legacy? It's sitting on a velvet cushion somewhere, probably sipping tea and ignoring the headlines. Next, we move from love affairs to full-blown royal earthquakes. Tonight, you're not slipping into a royal bedchamber, you're stepping into a constitutional crisis. There's no velvet curtain to draw here, no discreet exit through the servant's door. This is a royal affair that detonated like a scandal bomb across the entire British Empire, leaving pieces of the monarchy scattered on the front pages of every paper in the world. You're sitting beside Wallis Simpson, the woman who, depending on whom you ask, either saved King Edward VIII from himself or seduced a nation's future straight into chaos. This wasn't just a royal mistress, this was the mistress who made a king choose, the crown or her. Let's be real, the British monarchy had seen scandal before. Mistresses were practically ceremonial actresses, courtesans, duchesses, dancers, even some discreet male companions here and there. But by the time Edward VIII, known as David to his family, took the throne in 1936, things had changed. The press was powerful. The public had opinions, and the royal family had rules, or at least they were trying to. They needed order, stability, tradition. What they got was a king with all the restraint of a tabloid prince and a deeply inconvenient obsession with a twice-divorced American socialite. Here's your historical fact. Edward VIII abdicated the throne in December 1936 so he could marry Wallis Simpson, making him the only British monarch in history to voluntarily step down all for love, or lust, or codependency. The motivations are still up for debate, but the outcome is not. The crown passed to his brother, George VI, and the monarchy was yanked back from the brink by the most introverted man in England. Wallis went from mistress to duchess in the messiest way imaginable. Let's rewind, because this story doesn't work without context. Wallis wasn't born into royalty, or even close. She was from Baltimore, raised with just enough money to fake a pedigree. Her first marriage ended in divorce. Her second, to shipping executive Ernest Simpson, was crumbling by the time she met the Prince of Wales at parties in the early 1930s. She was stylish, witty, and uninterested in royal protocol, which made her absolutely irresistible to a man raised under the shadow of obligation. Edward fell hard. He lavished her with jewelry, nicknamed her My Beloved Wallis, and began taking her everywhere. She was introduced to his family awkward. She was given rooms near his quarters and eventually treated not just like a girlfriend but like a queen-in-waiting. Except there was one enormous problem: she was not legally available. Divorce was a huge deal in 1930s Britain, especially for the monarch, who also held the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England, which opposed remarriage after divorce if the ex-spouse was still living. Both of Wallis's exes were. The math wasn't good. Here's your fringe fact: Wallis Simpson never actually wanted to be queen. Multiple letters and sources suggest she was terrified of the public role and overwhelmed by the media frenzy. Some even argue she hoped Edward would tire of her before it all went too far. Instead, he doubled down, proposed, pushed harder, and when his government tried to block the marriage, Edward responded with, essentially, okay, then I'll take the crown and shove it in a drawer. Cue the constitutional crisis. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made it clear that the British government, the Church, and the Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, etc., would not accept Wallis as queen. They feared scandal, moral outrage, and public instability. Edward tried suggesting a morganatic marriage, where he could stay king and marry Wallis without making her queen. The idea was immediately rejected: no compromise, no deal, just a wall of no. On December 10, 1936, Edward signed the abdication papers, stating he could not do his job without the help and support of the woman I love. The next day, he broadcast his farewell over the radio, and you could almost hear Buckingham Palace collectively grinding its teeth. Wallis, meanwhile, had fled to France during the worst of the press firestorm. When they finally reunited, it wasn't exactly a royal fairy tale. It was quiet, a little bleak, and permanently awkward because the world had chosen sides, and many weren't on hers. Here's the scholarly debate. Was Wallis Simpson a manipulative social climber or a scapegoat for a king who was never fit to rule? Some historians argue she pushed Edward, using her influence to bend him away from duty. Others paint a more sympathetic picture of a woman who never asked for a throne and was dragged into history by a man more obsessed with her than with empire. What's clear is that Edward's abdication wasn't just about love, it was about resistance to expectation, tradition, and the idea that personal happiness should always come second to crown and country. The couple married in June 1937 in France, without a single member of the royal family attending. Edward was made Duke of Windsor, Wallis became a duchess, and they spent most of their lives in exile, hosting glamorous parties for the bored elite and awkwardly hanging around the edges of royal society. Edward never stopped resenting the decision. Wallis never stopped being blamed for it. Here's the eerie twist. Wallis lived long enough to see her great-nephew, Prince Charles, fall in love with Camilla Parker Bowles, another woman scorned for being the wrong choice. History didn't repeat exactly, but the shadow of Wallis loomed long over the royal playbook. Her story became a cautionary tale, a modern myth about love, sacrifice, and what happens when a monarch chooses passion over duty. So tonight, picture a Parisian apartment filled with orchids and regret. Edward plays records from his youth. Wallis sips from a glass of something strong, flips through a tabloid, and raises an eyebrow. Outside, a photographer waits. They're not royalty anymore, but they're still interesting, still scandalous, still together. Next, we leave the bedrooms behind for a minute and dig into the unspoken code of mistresshood itself, the rules, rewards, and quiet punishments of those who dance the razor-thin line between courtly love and total ruin. Tonight, you step away from the candlelit scandals and royal portraits to wander down a hallway far more private, lined not with paintings, but with silence. You've met the women who captivated kings, changed empires, and crowned illegitimate sons in the back rooms of palaces. But what held all that together wasn't just beauty, charm, or clever bedroom maneuvering, it was a system, a rhythm, a code, unspoken, unwritten, and incredibly precise. This is the world of the courtesan's code, the quiet rules every royal mistress had to follow if she wanted to survive the attention, the power, and, most importantly, the fall. Because make no mistake, in the high-stakes theatre of monarchy, being a mistress wasn't some soft-focus romance. It was a dangerous, high-wire performance with no net. One wrong move, and you weren't just out of favor, you were banished, disgraced, erased. The role demanded emotional precision, physical perfection, and political awareness sharper than a king's dagger. The women who lasted understood that the crown might sleep beside you, but it was never yours to touch. Let's break down the rules. The first, most sacred of all, discretion is survival. You don't write letters that can be found. You don't speak in crowded rooms. You never brag. This one rule could make or break a mistress before she even touched a satin bedsheet. Gossip has always been royal currency, and if you gave the court too much to whisper about, you weren't mysterious, you were dangerous. Madame de Pompadour mastered this rule. So did Alice Keppel. Even Wallis Simpson, amid global headlines, kept her personal letters cold, factual, unrevealing. She knew the game, even when she'd already lost the throne. Rule 2, you serve a function, or you don't last long. Beauty gets you in the door, usefulness keeps you in the room. The most successful mistresses weren't just pretty, they were political tools. Madame de Maintenon offered Louis XIV stability and quiet influence. Louise de Querouaille helped underscore accept ferry information between the French and English courts. Nell Gwyn, she was so beloved by the people that having her around actually helped the monarchy's image. Mistresses who couldn't make themselves useful, who didn't bring value beyond sex, were replaced like worn gloves, quickly, often cruelly. Here's your historical fact. Some courts had formal etiquette guides for how to interact with a royal mistress, complete with seating orders, how to address her, and how not to mention her presence in front of the Queen. In France, under Louis XV, These rules were so well known that mistresses had their own salons within Versailles, one room over from ministers and generals. If you were in the mistresses' circle, you had access to real power. But if you didn't know the rules, you were out faster than you could say lace-trimmed disgrace. Rule 3. You don't threaten the queen ever. No matter how much the king favors you, the queen is untouchable, at least publicly. A mistress who embarrassed the queen, openly competed with her, or tried to claim her status could find herself exiled, discredited, or mysteriously ill by morning. Even the most powerful women, like Madame de Montespan, walked this razor's edge. She was adored by Louis XIV, but once the poison scandal cracked her immaculate image, she was dropped and replaced by the quieter, more devout Maintenon. Just like that. Here's your fringe fact: royal mistresses were sometimes paid exit pensions when their services were no longer required. Think of it as severance pay for affection. These pensions came with land, jewels, sometimes entire estates, all in exchange for never speaking publicly again. It was hush money disguised as gratitude, and most mistresses took it gladly. Better to retire to a chateau than fight a queen and lose everything. But for all the whispered rules, some things couldn't be planned, like timing, childbirth, or jealousy. The reality is that a royal mistress's power had an expiration date the moment it began. Age, illness, a shifting alliance, or just plain boredom could knock her off the throne of the king's heart. While some women pivoted into marriage, religious life, or quiet retirement, others didn't. Some ended in scandal, poverty, even death. The same court that toasted them with champagne would, within weeks, laugh at their downfall. Public love was always conditional, always temporary. Here's the ongoing scholarly debate: did the courtesan's code empower women or entrap them in a system designed to chew them up? On one hand, it gave women unprecedented access to power in worlds where they couldn't vote, rule, or hold office. On the other, it forced them to perform perfection under pressure, rewarded silence over self-expression, and offered no long-term security. They were queens of nothing, but still expected to reign. Some historians argue this code was a form of proto-feminism, a workaround, a way to seize power without permission. Others say it was just another cage, this time lined with silk and pearls. Honestly, both sides are probably right. The court was never a place for simplicity, not in politics, not in love. So tonight, picture a royal mistress in her private chambers, slipping a sealed letter into the fire. She doesn't flinch as the flames rise. She's survived 5 years in the king's favor, an eternity. Outside, courtiers whisper, the new girl is arriving tomorrow, young, beautiful, untried. She smiles, adjusts her earrings. She's already packed her bags. Because if there's one rule no one writes down, it's this: you always leave before you're asked to. Next, we look at the ultimate power of these women, not just what they did in private, but how they rewrote the public story of monarchy, shaping politics and perception from behind a velvet curtain. Tonight, we pull the curtain back on what royal mistresses really did best. And no, it wasn't just what happened between silk sheets and behind velvet doors. The truth is far more interesting, far more dangerous, and far more lasting. Because while kings wore crowns and gave speeches, it was often the women they loved, unofficial, unacknowledged, and uninvited, who moved the real levers of history. Tonight, you're not peeking into a boudoir, you're walking into a shadowy strategy room where love was political currency, and mistresses didn't just soothe kings, they shaped kingdoms. We're talking about the political mistress, the woman who didn't just occupy the royal heart, but the royal agenda. The woman who quietly orchestrated wars, appointments, trade policies, and cultural renaissances from the wrong side of the throne. You've already met several of them, scattered through earlier chapters like glamorous landmines, Pompadour, Maintenon, Montespan, Diane. But now we look at how their influence stacked up, not as scandals, but as policy. Let's start with Madame de Pompadour, the undisputed high priestess of the political mistress model. She wasn't born noble, not even aristocratic, but Louis XV handed her the keys to Versailles, and she turned the French court into a cultural powerhouse. Art, architecture, philosophy, fashion, she curated it all. She helped fund Enlightenment thinkers, personally oversaw the construction of the Petit Trianon, and had a hand in managing France's foreign alliances. Her fingerprints are all over 18th-century French policy, from military blunders to intellectual booms. Here's your historical fact. Pompadour attended state council meetings, something no previous mistress had done openly. Her involvement in governance wasn't a rumor, it was routine. She was a diplomat, a patron, a manager of royal moods and ministers alike, even when their romantic relationship cooled. Louis kept her close because she was better at court politics than half the men he employed. Then there's Madame de Maintenon, whose rise was subtler but equally potent. As Louis XIV's likely secret wife, she became a kind of royal conscience, pushing him toward more conservative Catholic policies. Historians believe she played a key role in the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, one of the most disastrous religious moves in French history. It drove Protestant Huguenots out of France, tanking the economy and spurring unrest. That wasn't a random policy, it was a decision whispered in candlelit rooms between a king and the woman who'd become his spiritual advisor. Here's your fringe fact. Some royal mistresses were used as spy assets, planted or encouraged by foreign powers to seduce monarchs and leak intelligence. Louise de Keroualle was long suspected of being a French agent embedded in Charles II's court. She maintained tight correspondence with Louis XIV, received payments from the French crown, and was so unpopular in Protestant England that her presence practically sparked riots. Whether she actually transmitted state secrets remains a mystery, but her influence is confirmed. These women weren't deceptions, they were part of a pattern. The closer you got to the king's heart, the more access you had to his head. Ministers knew it. Ambassadors knew it. Even queens knew it. That's why so many courts treated mistresses not just as romantic distractions, but as political obstacles or assets. They were watched, wooed, bribed, in some cases assassinated. Because if you controlled the mistress, you controlled the king. Here's where the scholarly debate gets juicy. Did political mistresses usurp the natural order of governance, or did they compensate for its failings? Supporters argue that kings, often isolated, manipulated, or outright bored, needed someone outside the rigid hierarchy to give them perspective, and mistresses, unattached to court factions or rigid tradition, could offer honest counsel. Critics argue the opposite, that royal mistresses introduced dangerous emotional volatility into the political process, rewarding favorites and punishing enemies based on nothing more than pillow talk and perfume. The truth, of course, is that both happened. Sometimes the mistress was stabilizing, sometimes destabilizing. Sometimes she pushed reforms, sometimes she whispered for war. But one thing's certain, she was always heard. Take Catherine the Great, because yes, she deserves another mention. Her so-called favorites weren't just eye candy, they were part of a rotating cabinet. Potemkin helped manage her military campaigns. Others served as diplomats, interior ministers, even court architects. Her lovers didn't just touch her body, they helped build her empire. Even in Britain, where mistresses were less formally empowered, women like Alice Keppel served as informal advisors. She passed messages, managed crises, and kept Edward VII from doing something too catastrophic. The British press politely looked away, but inside the palace, everyone knew she was part of the machinery. Here's a quieter example. Harriet Spencer, sister of the Duchess of Devonshire, had a close relationship with King George IV, possibly physical, definitely emotional. She helped broker political alliances behind the scenes, working with her husband's contacts and her royal influence to secure Whig political victories in the early 1800s. The idea that royal lovers just lounged around nibbling sugared almonds? Pure fiction. Of course, the danger of the political mistress was always resentment. Queens hated them. Ministers distrusted them. Populaces grew angry, especially when wars failed or taxes rose, and someone remembered the mistress's latest diamond necklace. Being powerful didn't mean being safe, and many mistresses, no matter how clever, learned that the hard way. So tonight, picture a woman sitting across from a king, a wine glass in one hand, a map of Europe on the table. She's not making small talk, she's quoting letters from a general, advising restraint, suggesting who to trust and who to exile. She kisses him, sure, but that's not why she's there. She's there because no one else tells him the truth. And if she's careful, if she plays the game right, he just might listen. Next, We explore the beginning of the end, how royal mistresses lost their influence as scandal fatigue set in and monarchies tried to clean up their image for a modern, press-saturated world. Tonight, you watch the long twilight of the royal mistress. The era of secret corridors and diamond-studded hush money is fading. Kings still reign, for now, but the world around them is changing fast. Cameras are everywhere, parliaments are louder, empires are unraveling, and the people are watching more closely than ever. In this new world, the old games don't work quite the same way. The power of the mistress, once a throne-adjacent superpower, is being slowly, almost politely, dismantled. As monarchies scramble to survive the modern age, they begin to do the one thing they've never truly done before: pretend to behave. It's the 20th century now. The world has endured 2 world wars. Crowns have been knocked off heads from Russia to Romania. Britain has lost its empire, France its kings, Spain its monarchy on pause, at least. Surviving monarchs are finally understanding something crucial: you can't parade your mistress past 1,000 cameras and expect the public to clap. Discretion stops being a virtue and starts being a requirement. Take King George V, for instance, grandson of Edward VII, inheritor of all the flamboyant chaos. George was not flamboyant, he looked like a banker with an addiction to tweed. His reign marked the beginning of the dignified monarch model: stiff, silent, deeply boring, and deliberately so. The palace press office began to evolve. The royal image was scrubbed clean. The idea of a king publicly embracing a mistress became almost unthinkable. That was the point. Monarchy was now a performance of stability, not indulgence. Here's your historical fact: George's wife, Queen Mary, reportedly forbade him from maintaining even platonic female friendships outside their marriage, fearing press speculation. This was a hard pivot from Edward VII, who kept half of London's actresses in his social circle. The message was clear: no more scandal, no more public lovers, no more charming mistresses turned power brokers. And yet, they didn't disappear, they just went underground. Throughout the 20th century, royal families adopted a new rulebook: if there's a mistress, she must never be confirmed. Rumors were fine, necessary even, but confirmation? Absolutely not. This is the age of unofficial truths and royal denial, a long, elegant game of he's just a close friend of the family or she's simply assisting with charitable events. The same dynamics exist, the same power plays, but everything is veiled in plausible deniability. Here's your fringe fact: King Gustav V of Sweden, who ruled from 1907 to 1950, was the subject of whispered scandals involving both male and female companions. But no mistress or lover was ever officially acknowledged during his reign. That silence wasn't proof of chastity, it was part of a strategy. Keep the headlines clean, and no one asks too many questions. By mid-century, the mistress role wasn't just stigmatized, it was being actively erased. Royal marriages had to appear picture-perfect. Kings and queens were now brands, not just rulers, and brands couldn't afford bad press. So mistresses became smaller, less politically involved, less public. The elegant powerhouses of centuries past were replaced with socialites whose names appeared in gossip columns but never in state archives. Here's where the scholarly debate kicks in: was the disappearance of the royal mistress a moral evolution or just a better PR campaign? Some say monarchs finally cleaned up their act, embracing monogamy and duty like responsible national symbols. Others, less optimistic, argue that the same behaviors persisted, just more carefully managed. After all, isn't it convenient that mistresses vanished just as photography, radio, and TV became household fixtures? The best proof of this shift is the story of Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, long before they became husband and wife. For decades, Camilla was branded the other woman, a private figure whose public presence was politely unacknowledged. During Charles's marriage to Princess Diana, Camilla's name was a quiet but omnipresent shadow, uttered in tabloids, never by the palace. When the affair became undeniable, the backlash was volcanic, not because mistresses were new, but because the world had forgotten how to see one. The monarchy had spent a century pretending they didn't exist. Suddenly, they did again, and people didn't know whether to be outraged or relieved. You could feel the cultural tension. People wanted realness, but not mess, tradition, but not hypocrisy. The idea that a future king could be openly in love with a woman who'd once been his mistress. That wasn't just scandal, it was unprecedented in the modern British monarchy. And yet, look where we are now. Camilla is queen. She stands beside King Charles III, publicly, proudly, no longer in the shadows. It's almost poetic, right? The royal mistress, the role once designed to be discreet, expendable, invisible, finally put on the crown. But for most of the 20th century, that arc was not yet complete. The few women who drifted near royal beds did so knowing the rules had changed. No power, no voice, no policy. A relationship might bring companionship, even affection, but never legitimacy. It was back to being what it had been before the Louises and the Nells, a whispered truth with no place in the official story. Even abroad, in monarchies like those in the Middle East or Asia, the same shift occurred. Public consorts were all that mattered, mistresses were there, but always off stage. Royal PR became a global enterprise, and the narrative had to be clean, noble, family-friendly. So tonight, picture a lavish party in 1960s London. A prince in a tuxedo leans just a little too close to a laughing socialite. Cameras flash, but tomorrow there will be no story, no acknowledgement, just a polite photo in a newspaper with an anonymous caption, a friend of the family. She leaves alone, of course, she always does. Next, we step into the final chapter, the modern day, where the mistress role isn't just fading, it's being rewritten entirely by women who refuse to be silenced and royals who can no longer hide behind palace walls. Tonight, you find yourself in the electric present, the age of phones that never sleep, headlines that multiply by the second, and a royal family whose secrets are now everybody's entertainment. Welcome to the modern monarchy, where the word mistress still exists, but it's evolved, mutated, and splintered into something messier and far less manageable. The velvet drapes are gone. There are no secret staircases. If a royal wants to slip off for a midnight rendezvous, someone with a long-range lens is already in the bushes. The game has changed, and so has the mistress. In the past, a mistress lived in the shadows because she had to. Now, she's just as likely to be lit by 1,000 paparazzi flashes, her name trending worldwide before the coffee's brewed. Sometimes she's not even called a mistress, that words become almost too vintage, too loaded with historical glitter and powdered wigs. In the 21st century, the woman romantically linked to royalty without being his wife might be called a companion, a friend, a rumored partner, or, if the tabloids are feeling cheeky, a close confidant. But the dynamic remains the same. Love without a crown, power without a title, presence without permission. Here's your historical fact. Prince Albert of Monaco, son of Grace Kelly, has publicly acknowledged 2 children born out of wedlock with 2 different women, neither of whom he married. One was a flight attendant, the other a Togolese air hostess. Their names made headlines, and after paternity tests confirmed the rumors, Albert provided financial support and limited royal recognition to the children. But the women? No titles, no ceremonies, no thanks for your service. It's the 21st century, and the mistress still doesn't get a seat at the table. What's changed, though, is visibility. In previous centuries, mistresses operated under a court-sanctioned code of silence. Now they write memoirs, post Instagram stories, are tracked by the press in real time. When their relationships implode, it's not exile to a countryside estate, it's interviews, book deals, and primetime specials. The palace no longer controls the narrative, that power has shifted, too. Let's take the most seismic example of the modern era, Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, again. Because yes, this story loops back on itself like a soap opera with no end. Camilla wasn't just Charles's lover, she was his emotional anchor, his most enduring relationship, and, for decades, his most inconvenient truth. During his marriage to Princess Diana, the media painted Camilla as a homewrecker. Diana famously said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage." Camilla was vilified, mocked, chased by photographers through parking garages, and yet she stayed. Here's your fringe fact. In the early 90s, the Camillagate tapes leaked, revealing a deeply personal, intimate phone conversation between Charles and Camilla, recorded without their consent. The content was scandalous, the invasion of privacy even worse. But instead of breaking her, it hardened her public image. Camilla didn't disappear, she endured, quietly, strategically. In 2005, she married the future king. The mistress became the wife and now the queen consort. It was, in many ways, the final transformation of the role, no longer hidden or shameful. Camilla's trajectory forced the public to confront the idea that love doesn't always arrive in the proper order. She didn't erase Diana's legacy. She didn't pretend the past didn't happen. She simply waited it out. Time, after all, is the mistress's best friend. But not all stories end with a crown. In recent years, new rumors and revelations have shaken the walls of Buckingham Palace, from whispers around Prince Andrew's associations with Jeffrey Epstein to the ongoing public fallout between Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and the rest of the royal family. One truth is clearer than ever: the modern royal world no longer protects its secrets. If there are mistresses, lovers, or side relationships, they're no longer discussed in whispered codes, they're exposed, debated, dissected online in minutes. Here comes the scholarly debate: has the mistress role truly evolved, or has it just gone digital? Some argue that the power once wielded in private is now dispersed across public platforms. The mistress can post her own story, control her own brand, refuse the quiet erasure of the past. Others say that while the tools have changed, the core dynamic remains: unofficial, unprotected, uninvited. The royal machine still prefers its scandals to be temporary, its lovers to be seen and not heard, its public image to be immaculate. But silence isn't the default anymore. Women who were once written out of history are now writing themselves back in. Former mistresses go on talk shows. Their children sue for inheritance. Their relationships are debated by historians, bloggers, and people with anonymous usernames and way too much time. It's messy, it's human, and it's finally honest. So tonight, picture a woman, smart, poised, somewhere between scandal and sympathy, sitting in front of a camera. Maybe she's a former lover of a prince, maybe the daughter of one, maybe only rumored to be. But her voice is steady, her message clear. She's not disappearing. She's not hiding. And if the palace doesn't acknowledge her, fine, the internet already has. Next, we arrive at the final chapter: not a scandal, not a fall from grace, but a soft landing. A look at how the legacy of royal mistresses shaped the world and how the echoes of their influence still ripple through every gilded hall where love and power collide. Tonight, we bring it all home, not with a bang, but with a knowing smile and the soft rustle of silk across centuries. You've met the powerhouses, the tacticians, the heartbreakers, the survivors. You've slipped into Versailles, stumbled through Victorian fog, peeked into Windsor's back rooms, and squinted at palace press releases trying to decode who a close personal friend of the royal family really is. But now the curtain falls, not on scandal, but on legacy. Because the royal mistress, for all her opulence and controversy, shaped history just as much as the monarch she loved. Her fingerprints are still everywhere, you just have to know where to look. First, let's acknowledge the obvious: none of these women ever sat on a throne. They didn't wear crowns. Their names weren't engraved on currency. Their portraits didn't hang in state galleries, at least, not officially. But when you trace the decisions that forged empires, toppled governments, redrew borders, or birthed rebellions, you'll often find a woman in the room who wasn't supposed to be there: a mistress, a companion, a lover with impeccable timing and more influence than any court official would ever publicly admit. Take Madame de Pompadour's patronage of Enlightenment thinkers, which directly fed into the intellectual climate that eventually exploded in revolution. Or Nell Gwyn's popularity with the common people, helping to humanize Charles II after years of Puritan rule. Or even the way Wallis Simpson's romance with Edward VIII forced the British monarchy into a constitutional reshuffle that paved the way for Queen Elizabeth II's unexpected rise. These women weren't footnotes, they were plot twists.